Those of you joining us on our Facebook live stream, we're glad you're here as well. Our text this morning is from Isaiah, the 5th chapter, verses 1 through 7, and the 11th chapter, verses 1 through 5. Once again, we hear about a prophet doing what prophets do. Today, the prophet is Isaiah, and Isaiah is bringing a clarification to the people about what it is that God is expecting and how they have stepped outside the lines of what God is desiring. This is one of those rare readings in the Bible that I am happy to run across. It's a rare reading because it explains itself and it makes sense out of the gate without having to do a lot of investigation and unpacking and study and all that. In verse 7, it explains it very clearly. For the vineyard of the Lord of hosts is the house of Israel, and the people of Judah are his pleasant planting. He expected justice, but he saw bloodshed. Righteousness, but heard a cry. The story is an agricultural metaphor because in the Bible writing times it was an agricultural society. Not everybody worked in ag, but everybody kind of knew what was going on in ag. They may not have understood the fine details of putting a vineyard together, but they would have understood the basic building blocks, kind of like most of us have some sense of what it means to farm around here today. God has planted a people called Judah, that is the part of the Israelite nation, and done everything possible to create a system of justice throughout the land. The hill was very fertile and cleared all the stones, that is, cleared all the roadblocks out of the way. God plants the choicest vines, as the people of God then were known as the chosen ones, the chosen people. God plants a watchtower, meaning God is watching over all the things and keeping an eye on things as they transpire. And digs a wine vat in the middle of all this because God has an expectation that the harvest will fill that wine vat. The harvest being a society where justice reigns. Apparently, that is not how it played out. Clearly, God has done all the necessary work as is described in the metaphor of the vineyard. God has cleared the way and put the people where they're supposed to be, and meanwhile, God expects them to do well by one another. Predictably, for humanity then, the result turns out to be less than what God desired. We've seen this play out repeatedly in our readings the past several weeks with David and Solomon and Rehoboam and Jeroboam and all that stuff. They don't live out the life that God has desired. We know that it plays out similarly in society today. We live in a time of great conflict. That's a newsflash, I know. The news feeds are filled with it every day, it seems like. Many people say and believe that it is the worst time of conflict since the Civil War. And it's easy to get caught up in the righteousness of whatever side of the argument you find yourself on. I wonder if the conflict is as bad as the advertisers want us to think. And here's why I ask that question. No doubt, what we hear in the various news outlets is less than good. You are consulting multiple sources before you form an opinion, right? Okay. But I think the basic human condition is about the same as it has been in earlier years. We just don't hear about most of it. Information took a lot longer to travel around, and so not every bit of information was known and readily available. Here's an example of what I'm talking about. If you're familiar with the author John Grisham, he writes legal thrillers. In 2018, he wrote The Reckoning, set in 1946 Mississippi. And the main set of characters need to talk to each other fairly frequently because the dad of the character set is been convicted of murder and is going to the electric chair. So they have a lot of stuff they need to discuss, but they can't discuss it from their phone because they're on a party line. Anybody grow up on a party line? Everybody know what a party line is? It's, you have one phone line that services 8 different households, and if you want to listen to what's going on in the neighborhood, you just pick up. Sometimes they could tell, sometimes they couldn't. So if you had anything, important to talk about, you didn't talk about it on the party line because that news was going to get everywhere. Because somebody was almost always listening. I had a party line until I was in like 5th or 6th grade. And this is still in 1946 Mississippi. So, If any of these characters in this kind of messy situation of dad being in prison needs to talk to their lawyers and whatnot, they have to go to town where they have a friend that lives in town that has a private line. Thus, communication was not quick and fast and immediate. Discussions took a lot longer because you had to drive to town to start the discussion. Getting information from point A to point B took a lot longer, and only the biggest stories make the trip, like the characters in the novel and like our experience today. Everything else remained unknown or just locked in the closet. Things are different today where information and stories are transported easily and quickly. And thus, I know what many of you had for lunch last week. I do the same thing. I had the last BLT of the season last week, but I forgot to post it on Instagram and Facebook. Ask me about it, I'll show you the picture later. This is a kind of information overload that feeds us far too much information that distorts our view of other people. And it ultimately gets in the way of following God's will, particularly God's will to treat each other well and with a sense of justice. That's information overload. We have access to too much information on a 24/7 basis, and that gets in the way of paying attention to God. You can blame whoever you want, but we're all guilty at some point of not following God's will. Just look at the stories in the Bible. I don't see many people actually following God's will. Hence, we hear from the prophets a fair amount as the prophets point out to the people how and why they're not following God's will. Frankly, as far as I can tell, there was only one character who did follow God's will, and that was Jesus. The rest of them, even the best of them, managed to screw up, as faithful as they tried to be. But Jesus enacted God's desire for justice on each of us by going to the cross and dying for the forgiveness of our sins. That's the green shoot of hope that we hear in the second part of today's reading. That hope that there's something better coming, even when it feels like we are in the middle of a deep and dark winter. The question that each of us needs to answer is simply this: is what I'm doing what God desires, or am I following my own desires? Even the best, following God's desires should be a priority in our lives, and one of those deep down questions that we ask ourselves on a fairly regular basis. I know it's easier to cruise along with whatever it is that we're familiar with, in amongst all the noise of information overload that surrounds us. But if information is overloading us to the point we don't have time for God, we need a little less information and a lot more God. To God be the glory. Amen. I invite you to please stand as you are comfortable and continue to worship this song.